The Old Soldier's New Day. Joe Thompson, an 82-year-old veteran, awoke with the precision of a soldier. His joints creaked in protest as he shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face to shake off the remnants of sleep. He stared at his reflection, his dark skin weathered by years of service and time, the deep lines etched into his face, telling a story of both joy and pain. As he caught a glimpse of himself in his youth, sharp, focused, ready to take on the world, he was momentarily transported back to his early days in the military, the medals that hung in his closet a silent testament to his service. Today was Sunday, and Joe intended to have a peaceful breakfast at a new place, the Cozy Corner Café. His usual spot had closed temporarily for renovations, and although he was a creature of habit, Joe saw this as an opportunity to step outside his routine. He had heard good things about the Cozy Corner. The scrambled eggs, people said, were exceptional. Joe dressed carefully, putting on his slacks, a button-down shirt, and his old military jacket adorned with the medals he had earned over a lifetime of service. The jacket wasn't just a garment, it was a symbol of his identity, his sacrifices, and the respect he believed he had earned. As he donned his military cap, the final touch, Joe stood tall and headed out the door. Today was going to be a good day, or so he hoped. The streets of Ashwood were quiet, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves as Joe walked towards the cafe. He passed neighbors who greeted him with nods, though not everyone returned his smile. The town, while peaceful on the surface, carried an undercurrent of prejudice that Joe had long learned to navigate. Some days it was more palpable than others. As Joe reached the Cozy Corner Café, he admired the charming storefront. It had large windows that allowed the warm interior light to spill onto the sidewalk and a hand-painted sign that read, "Where everyone's welcome." He hoped the sentiment held true as he opened the door, stepping inside to the soft chime of the entrance bell. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The cafe was busy, but not overcrowded. Joe's eyes took in the cozy booths, the soft yellow lights, and the patrons enjoying their Sunday breakfast. He felt a little out of place, but he wasn't one to shy away from new experiences. A young waitress, Sarah, approached him with a warm smile. "Good morning, sir. Would you like a table or a spot at the counter?" she asked cheerfully. "A booth would be nice, if you have one," Joe replied, his voice calm and polite. He found himself smiling back at her. "Right this way," Sarah said, leading him to a booth near the window. "This is a nice spot. You can watch the town while you enjoy your meal." Joe settled into the booth, adjusting his military jacket as he did so. The vinyl seat creaked softly beneath him, adding to the homey atmosphere. Sarah handed him a menu. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" "That would be great, thank you," Joe replied. As Sarah moved away to fetch his coffee, Joe scanned the room again. Families sat together, enjoying their meals. A group of bikers in the corner laughed boisterously, their leather jackets and tattoos standing in contrast to the otherwise quiet atmosphere. Joe felt the familiar mix of caution and hope that often accompanied him in new places. He wanted to believe that this cafe would live up to its welcoming sign, but he knew better than to expect too much. The menu boasted an array of classic breakfast dishes, but Joe's eyes were drawn to the special, scrambled eggs with crispy bacon and golden hash browns. It sounded like the perfect way to start his day. Sarah returned with a steaming cup of coffee, placing it gently in front of Joe. "Are you ready to order?" Before Joe could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and a man emerged. He was tall, bald, and his name tag identified him as Frank, the cafe's owner. At first, Frank seemed to be in a good mood, surveying his cafe with pride. But when his eyes landed on Joe, something changed. The friendly smile he had been wearing disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard frown. Joe had seen that look before, too many times to count. Frank walked briskly towards Joe's table, his face set in a determined scowl. Joe braced himself, his hand tightening around the mug of coffee. He wasn't going to let this man ruin his morning, but he knew what was coming. "Can I help you?" Joe asked calmly, his eyes meeting Frank's without wavering. "We're full," Frank said, his voice gruff. "You'll have to leave." Joe blinked, momentarily taken aback. He glanced around the cafe. There were several empty tables, and the place was far from full. He could feel the eyes of other patrons on him now, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension. "I'm sorry," Joe said evenly, "but there seems to be plenty of open seats." Frank's expression hardened. "I said we're full," he repeated, louder this time. Joe stared at him for a moment, a lifetime of dealing with discrimination bubbling beneath the surface. He had fought for this country, put his life on the line, and yet here he was, still being told he didn't belong. But Joe wasn't going to back down. Not today. "I'd like to finish my coffee," Joe said, his voice steady. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a fact. Frank's face flushed red with anger. "You need to leave. Now." Before Joe could respond, the door to the cafe opened again, and a group of men entered. They were the bikers from the corner, leather jackets creaking as they approached Joe's table. For a brief moment, Joe wondered if this confrontation was about to get worse. But then the leader of the group spoke, his voice low but firm. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his gaze shifting between Frank and Joe. Frank hesitated, his confidence faltering. The bikers stood with their arms crossed, watching him closely. Joe remained silent, waiting to see how this would play out. "No," Frank said finally, his voice wavering. "No problem at all." The biker nodded once, then turned to Joe. "Mind if we sit with you, sir?" Joe smiled, a quiet victory blooming in his chest. "I'd be honored," he replied. As the bikers settled into the booth with him, Frank retreated to the kitchen, his face a mask of frustration. Joe sipped his coffee, savoring the warmth of both the drink and the unexpected companionship. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged. A quiet storm. Joe sat silently in the booth, his hands resting gently on the edges of the table, the warmth of his coffee cup now a distant comfort. The tension between him and Frank, the cafe owner, crackled in the air like a brewing storm, a palpable energy that had drawn the attention of nearby patrons. But Joe was no stranger to storms. He had weathered them all his life. Frank stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, blocking the sunlight that had been streaming in through the windows. His face was set in a stern, almost defiant expression. But beneath the bluster, Joe could see something else. It wasn't just anger. It was fear, the kind of fear that only surfaced when someone felt that their carefully ordered world was being disrupted. Joe had seen this look countless times over the decades, in the eyes of men who didn't understand, who didn't want to understand. But something about this situation felt different. Here, in this small cafe that was supposed to be a place of warmth and community, Joe felt the familiar sting of exclusion. He had fought too long and too hard to turn around now. Frank cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had hung heavy between them. "I said we're full. You'll have to go. We don't serve people like you here." There it was, frank and unapologetic, laid bare without pretense. A few patrons nearby shifted in their seats, casting glances toward Joe and Frank. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, but no one intervened. They simply watched, waiting to see what would unfold. Joe didn't blame them. He had lived long enough to know that people often found it easier to remain on the sidelines of someone else's struggle. Joe took a slow breath, holding Frank's gaze. "People like me," he repeated, his voice calm, almost gentle. He had learned over the years that raising his voice wasn't always the best way to fight back. Sometimes, it was better to hold steady, to let the weight of words sink in without anger. Frank bristled at the question, his face flushing a deep red. He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable under the veteran's steady stare. "You know what I mean," he muttered. "You can't just come in here like you own the place. We have a certain clientele here." Joe remained silent for a moment, letting the words hang in the air between them. He could feel his heart beating steadily in his chest, a familiar rhythm that reminded him of his years in the military. He had faced down enemies on battlefields far from home, had stood strong against foes who had tried to take everything from him. He wasn't about to let a small-minded cafe owner chase him away now. "I fought for this country," Joe finally said, his voice low and even. "I wore the uniform with pride. I did my part so that people like you could run your businesses in peace, so that people like you could have the freedom to live your lives without fear. And I spent my whole life hoping that one day I wouldn't have to explain that to someone." Frank's expression faltered for just a moment, a flicker of doubt passing over his face, but it was quickly replaced with the same stubborn anger. "That's not my problem," he snapped. "I'm running a business here, and I get to decide who I serve." Joe met his gaze steadily, unflinching. "You're right," he said, nodding slightly. "You do get to decide. But that decision says a lot more about you than it does about me." For a moment, the cafe was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft clink of plates and utensils from the kitchen. The other customers were watching now, their conversations forgotten as they waited to see what would happen next. Frank shifted uncomfortably on his feet, the weight of the eyes on him clearly starting to get to him. He glanced around the room, noticing that his patrons were no longer absorbed in their meals. His discomfort was evident, but he was still too proud to back down. "Look," Frank said, his voice a little lower now. "I don't want any trouble. But this is my place, and I've got a right to say who stays and who goes. You're making the other customers uncomfortable." Joe looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the other diners. Some of them avoided his gaze, others looked back at him with sympathy. But none of them seemed particularly uncomfortable. If anything, they seemed more interested in the drama playing out before them than anything else. "You know," Joe said quietly, turning back to Frank, "I've heard that excuse before. Making people uncomfortable. It's what they said when I couldn't sit at a lunch counter in my own hometown. It's what they said when they wouldn't let me through the front door of the department store. They were uncomfortable, they said. But you know what I think." Frank shifted uneasily, clearly not wanting to engage any further but unable to walk away. "I think people are only uncomfortable when they're forced to confront something they don't want to see, something that challenges the way they think about the world." Frank swallowed hard, the bravado starting to slip away. He didn't know how to respond to Joe's words, so he stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Just then, the group of bikers in the corner, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, stood up. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and a leather jacket covered in patches, approached the table, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Joe glanced up at the man as he approached, not entirely sure what to expect. But the man's face wasn't filled with hostility. Instead, there was something like respect in his eyes. "Is there a problem here?" the biker asked, his voice rough but calm. Frank's eyes darted toward the group of bikers, his resolve clearly wavering. "No problem," he muttered, though his tone lacked the certainty it had held moments ago. "Just a misunderstanding." The biker folded his arms across his chest, looking from Frank to Joe, and then back again. "Doesn't seem like much of a misunderstanding to me," he said. "Seems like this man just wants to have breakfast, and you're making a big deal out of it." Frank's face flushed an even deeper red, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't need you to tell me how to run my cafe," he snapped, his voice rising in frustration. The biker raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Frank's outburst. "Maybe not," he said, his tone calm and even. "But it seems like you could use some help figuring out how to treat people with a little decency." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the tension. "I think you should let the man eat." It was a woman this time, an older lady seated a few tables over. She had been watching quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Now she spoke with a quiet authority that made everyone stop and listen. "He's done nothing wrong," she continued, her voice calm but firm. And I, for one, would like to finish my breakfast without watching you make a fool of yourself." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe, other patrons nodding their heads or voicing their support. Frank looked around, suddenly aware that the tide had turned against him. His bravado melted away completely, leaving behind only a man who had backed himself into a corner with his own prejudices. For a moment, Joe thought Frank might say something more, might try to dig himself out of the hole he had created. But instead, Frank simply turned on his heel and stormed back into the kitchen, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. The biker looked down at Joe, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked. Joe nodded, a warm feeling of gratitude swelling in his chest. "I'd be honored," he said. As the biker slid into the booth across from him, the tension in the cafe began to dissipate. Conversations resumed, the clink of silverware and the hum of voices filling the air once more. But something had shifted. The small act of kindness from a stranger, the solidarity of the patrons, had transformed what could have been an ugly confrontation into a moment of unity. Joe looked out the window, watching the people of Ashwood move about their day, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was calm. But more importantly, there was change. The weight of history. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the window of the cafe as Joe and the biker, who introduced himself as Ray, settled into their conversation. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced by the comfortable hum of ordinary life. It felt strange, almost surreal, how quickly things had shifted. But Joe knew better than to assume that a single moment of solidarity would erase the weight of years, the weight of history. As Joe stirred the remnants of his coffee, he couldn't help but feel the echoes of the past in every corner of the small town of Ashwood. He had lived long enough to recognize that some things were harder to change than others, and prejudice was one of them. People like Frank weren't unique. There were always men like him, clinging to an old world that had long since crumbled. Ray, the biker, took a sip of his iced tea, his sharp eyes watching Joe carefully. He seemed like a man who had seen his share of rough times, but there was a kindness in his gaze, a quiet understanding that came from experience rather than judgment. Joe found himself grateful for the presence of this stranger, whose unexpected kindness had diffused what could have been an explosive situation. "So, you're just passing through Ashwood?" Ray asked, breaking the silence. Joe nodded. "Yeah, just passing through. Thought I'd stop in for a bite before I hit the road again." He paused, studying Ray's face. Didn't expect to stir up all that trouble. Ray chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You didn't stir up anything. That guy, Frank, he's been like that for as long as I can remember. You just happened to be the one who made him show his true colors." Joe sighed. "Yeah, well, I'm used to it. Been dealing with people like him my whole life." He set his spoon down and leaned back in his seat. "But I'm too old to be fighting these battles all the time." Ray nodded thoughtfully, his eyes drifting to the window as he considered Joe's words. "I get that. It's exhausting, man. But sometimes you don't get a choice. Sometimes the fight finds you." Joe looked down at his hands, scared and calloused from years of hard work. Ray wasn't wrong. Joe hadn't gone looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. He'd spent his life standing up for what was right, even when it cost him dearly. He wasn't a hero, just a man trying to live with some dignity. "You ever think about settling down?" Ray asked suddenly, catching Joe off guard. Joe raised an eyebrow, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Settle down." "Me?" He chuckled softly. "I spent my whole life on the move. The road is the only home I've ever known." Ray shrugged, but there was a glint of understanding in his eyes. "I get that. Freedom. Being able to pick up and go whenever you want. It's tempting. But there's something to be said for having roots too." Joe fell silent, contemplating Ray's words. Roots. The idea seemed foreign to him now, after so many years of wandering. His military service had taken him to the farthest corners of the world, and after he left the army, he found himself drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. He had no family, no real ties to any place, just the open road, stretching endlessly before him. But as he sat there, watching the light fade outside the cafe, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to find a place to rest. The door to the cafe jingled as someone entered, breaking the momentary silence. Joe glanced over and saw a young woman walk in, carrying a stack of flyers. Her face was familiar. She had been one of the patrons earlier, sitting in the back and watching the exchange between Joe and Frank with quiet intensity. Now she moved quickly through the room, placing the flyers on the counter and at each table as she went. Ray watched her with interest, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's Maggie," he said under his breath. "She runs the town's community center. Good kid. Always trying to get people involved in stuff." Joe followed her with his eyes as she approached their table, a small smile playing on her lips. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, but there was a certain confidence in her step that made her seem older, more experienced. "Hi," she said, holding out one of the flyers. "I don't mean to interrupt, but we're having a town meeting tonight at the community center. It's open to everyone, and we'd love for you to come by." Joe took the flyer, glancing at it briefly. It was a simple piece of paper, printed with details about the meeting, but there was something about the way Maggie looked at him that made him pause. It wasn't just an invitation. It felt like an olive branch, an offer to be part of something bigger than himself. Ray nodded appreciatively at her. "Maggie, this is Joe. He's just passing through, but I bet he'd be interested in what you've got going on." Maggie's eyes lit up. "Oh, definitely. We're trying to get more people involved in the community, especially with everything that's been happening lately. There's been a lot of division, and we're hoping to bring people together. You know, get everyone on the same page." Joe smiled politely, folding the flyer in half and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "I appreciate the invite," he said, "but I'm just passing through. Don't know if I'll be around that long." Maggie didn't seem fazed. "That's okay, even if you're just here for a little while. We'd love to have you. Sometimes it's the voices from the outside that help us see things differently." Joe nodded, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to people reaching out to him like this, especially not in small towns like Ashwood. Most places he passed through barely noticed his presence, let alone invited him to participate in community events. It was strange, but also nice. After Maggie left, Ray leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on Joe. "You should go." Joe raised an eyebrow. "To the meeting?" Ray nodded. "Yeah, I know you're not planning on sticking around, but maybe it's worth hearing what people have to say. This town's been through a lot lately, and it sounds like they're trying to make some changes. Maybe you could offer some perspective." Joe laughed softly. "You think I've got anything to say that these folks haven't heard already?" Ray shrugged. "You never know. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who end up making the biggest impact." Joe considered this for a moment, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. He had spent his life as a soldier, a man of action, not words. But as he grew older, he had come to realize that words had their own kind of power. Maybe there was something he could offer to this small town, even if it was just for one night. Ray seemed to sense Joe's hesitation and leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Look, man, I know you've been through a lot. Hell, we all have. But if you've got a chance to make a difference, even if it's just for one person, isn't it worth trying?" Joe stared down at his hands, the scars and lines etched into his skin like a map of his life. Ray's words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. He had spent his whole life trying to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Maybe this was just another battle, another storm to weather. Finally, he looked up at Ray and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll go." Ray grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good man." The sun had fully set by the time Joe and Ray left the cafe, the sky a deep, inky blue dotted with stars. The streets of Ashwood were quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets or the distant hum of a car engine. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. As they walked toward the community center, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Maybe it was the town, or maybe it was something within himself. Either way, he knew that tonight was just the beginning. "You said, continue with part 4 more unique and lengthy." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 4. A Town Divided. The community center was a modest building, nestled between a church and an old grocery store, its walls adorned with faded posters advertising local events, fundraisers, and small-town festivals. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Ashwood Community Center, a place for all." As Joe and Ray approached, they could see a small crowd gathering inside, the soft murmur of voices spilling out into the evening air. Joe felt a pang of apprehension as they stepped through the door. He wasn't one for public meetings or group discussions, especially in a town where he was a stranger. But something about this place, the people, and the unexpected invitation from Maggie had sparked a curiosity within him. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe he did have something to offer. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a small stage where a podium stood, flanked by a projector screen. The room had the familiar scent of stale coffee and old wood, the kind of smell that reminded Joe of town hall meetings and veterans gatherings he had attended in the past. It was a space built for community, though it seemed tonight the sense of unity was frayed. The people of Ashwood were a diverse bunch. There were older folks, their faces weathered from years of hard work, sitting quietly with their arms crossed. Young families with kids sat in the back, trying to keep their children occupied with coloring books and snacks. A few younger people, like Maggie, mingled near the front, chatting in hushed tones. But there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Joe could see it in the way people glanced at one another, in the way conversations were brief and strained. There were divides here, divides that ran deep. Maggie spotted Joe and Ray from across the room and waved them over with a bright smile. She was standing near the podium, talking to a man Joe assumed was the town's mayor. He was a stout figure with a graying beard and a kind face, though the lines of stress and fatigue were etched clearly into his features. "Hey, you made it," Maggie said as they approached. "I'm glad you decided to come." Joe nodded, feeling a little out of place but grateful for her warmth. "Thanks for the invite. Looks like there's quite a crowd." The mayor extended his hand to Joe. "Name's Bill Thompson. I'm the mayor around here, though some days it feels more like I'm the referee." Joe shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of a man used to dealing with problems big and small. "Joe, just passing through." "Well, Joe, you've picked an interesting night to pass through," Bill said, glancing around the room. "We're trying to get this town back on track, but not everyone's on the same page." Maggie sighed, looking out over the gathering crowd. "There's been a lot of tension lately. Frank and his group, well, you saw what happened earlier. They'd been stirring things up, trying to push their own agenda. It's been hard to get people to come together." Ray leaned against a nearby table, crossing his arms. "What kind of agenda are they pushing?" Bill frowned, lowering his voice. "Frank and his lot. They're old school. They don't like change, don't like outsiders. They've been fighting tooth and nail against every effort to modernize this town, to bring in new people and new ideas. It's like they're stuck in the past." Joe could see the frustration in Bill's eyes, the exhaustion of a man trying to hold something together that was slowly unraveling. He had seen it before, in the eyes of leaders on the battlefield, commanders trying to manage divisions within their ranks while the enemy loomed ever closer. It was a familiar struggle. "So what's the plan?" Joe asked, his military instincts kicking in. "How do you bring people together when they're pulling in different directions?" Bill sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's the question, isn't it? We're hoping tonight we can at least start a conversation. get people to air their grievances, but also listen to each other. It's not going to be easy, but we have to try. Maggie nodded in agreement. We're trying to get everyone to see that we're stronger together, that the town can't survive if we're constantly fighting each other. But it's hard. Some folks just don't want to change. Joe felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the weight of responsibility. He wasn't from Ashwood, and this wasn't his fight, but something about the situation resonated with him. Maybe it was the echoes of the battles he had fought in the past, the wars both on the battlefield and within his own soul. Or maybe it was the simple truth that sometimes a person had to stand up, even if it wasn't their battle to fight. As people continued to trickle in, the room filled with the soft hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional raised voice or sharp comment. Joe noticed a group of men near the back, Frank and his cronies. They stood in a tight cluster, their arms crossed, talking amongst themselves in low tones. Frank's face was set in a hard scowl, his eyes scanning the room like a predator looking for its next target. The tension was palpable. Maggie took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned to her. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "Thank you all for coming. I know it's not always easy to take time out of your day for something like this, but I believe it's important. We're here tonight to talk about the future of Ashwood and how we can move forward together." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I know there have been a lot of disagreements lately, and I'm not here to pretend that those differences don't exist. But we can't let those differences tear us apart. We have to find a way to work together, to find common ground, or this town will wither away." There was a murmur of agreement from some in the crowd, but Frank's group remained silent, their expressions stony. Maggie glanced at Bill, who gave her an encouraging nod before she continued. "So tonight, we're going to open the floor to anyone who wants to speak. Share your thoughts, your concerns, but let's also try to listen to each other. Let's try to find solutions, not just point fingers." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a hand went up from the front row. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a quiet voice. "I just want to say that I've lived in Ashwood my whole life, and I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some bad. But I think we need to remember what made this town special in the first place. It's the people. We've always been a close-knit community, and we can't lose that. We can't let fear drive us apart." Her words seemed to resonate with the crowd, and a few others nodded in agreement. But as soon as she finished, Frank stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer. "Fear," he scoffed, his voice loud and confrontational. "It's not fear. It's common sense. This town has been fine for generations without all these newfangled ideas and outsiders coming in, telling us how to live our lives. We don't need change. We need to protect what's ours." The room fell into a tense silence as Frank's words hung in the air, charged with anger and defiance. Joe felt his muscles tighten, his instincts screaming to intervene, but he held back, watching and waiting. Maggie didn't flinch. She kept her composure, her eyes locked on Frank. "No one is trying to take anything away from you, Frank," she said calmly. "But we have to adapt. We have to grow. Otherwise, this town will be left behind." Frank snorted, shaking his head. "Left behind? By who?" "A bunch of city folks who don't understand what it means to live here. We don't need them. We don't need their help. We've been doing just fine without them." The room buzzed with murmurs of disagreement, but Frank's group stood firm, their faces hardened with defiance. The lines were drawn, and it was clear that this was more than just a disagreement about the future. It was a battle for the soul of the town. Joe felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had seen this before, conflict brewing beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't soldiers. They were ordinary people, caught in the crossfire of change and tradition. Finally, Joe stood up, drawing the attention of the room. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable authority in it, an authority forged in the fires of war and tempered by experience. "Frank's right about one thing," Joe began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This town has been through a lot, and change isn't easy. But if you let fear and anger drive your decisions, you'll tear this place apart." Frank's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I've seen places like this before," Joe continued, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen what happens when people let fear control them. It doesn't end well. You've got a chance here, a chance to build something better. But it's not going to happen if you're too busy fighting each other to see the bigger picture." The room was a voice of reason. As Joe's words hung in the air, a thick silence fell over the room. His deep, steady voice, weathered by experience, seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. The people of Ashwood, some leaning forward in their chairs, others exchanging quiet glances, were now fully focused on this outsider. Joe had no intention of making this about him, but sometimes it took a fresh perspective to stir a community, to make them see what was in front of them. Frank, arms still crossed and face twisted into a scowl, remained unyielding, though the hardened expression in his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Joe's words had touched something, even in him, though Frank was far from backing down. Joe knew the type, men who had defined themselves through resistance, who saw compromise as weakness. But Ashwood didn't need more division. It needed leaders who could bridge gaps. Joe took a slow, measured breath, gathering his thoughts. If he had learned anything in the military, it was how to manage conflict, not by overpowering the enemy, but by understanding what drove them. He had seen enough bloodshed to know that battles like this could be won with words just as easily as with force. "I'm not from Ashwood," Joe said, making no attempt to hide the truth. "I haven't lived through the same struggles you all have. I don't know your history the way you do. But what I do know, what I've seen, is that the hardest fights aren't the ones you face with your fists. They're the ones that challenge what you believe about your own people." He let the words settle, watching the crowd carefully. Maggie, standing near the podium, gave him a small nod of encouragement. Ray, always the skeptic, remained leaning against the back wall, arms folded, observing the scene as if it were some kind of sociological experiment. Yet even Ray, Joe could tell, was waiting to see where this conversation might go. Joe continued, "I've been in places that were torn apart by fear and anger. I've seen villages, communities, entire nations ripped at the seams because people couldn't sit down and listen to one another, because they let fear of change, fear of the unknown, rule them. And let me tell you, once that happens, it's hard to come back from." There was a murmur from somewhere in the crowd, a soft voice of agreement, but Frank's side remained stoic. Joe had expected this kind of reaction, but he wasn't done yet. "But here's the thing," Joe said, his voice growing a little stronger. "It doesn't have to be that way. You have a choice tonight. You can either keep fighting each other, tearing down everything you've built, or you can find a way to move forward together. Maybe you don't agree on every detail. Hell, maybe you don't agree on much at all. But if you don't figure out how to compromise, then someone, some outsider, will come in and make the decisions for you. And trust me, you won't like what they choose." That last sentence struck a chord. Joe could feel it in the room, the tension shifting from outright hostility to something more contemplative. People were listening now, really listening. Maggie stepped up beside Joe, sensing the shift in the crowd. Her voice was softer, more personal, but filled with the same resolve. "Joe's right. This town, it's special. We all know that. But what makes it special isn't just the land or the buildings or the history. It's the people. It's the way we come together in times of need. And right now, we need each other more than ever." Frank uncrossed his arms, but he wasn't ready to concede. His eyes bore into Joe's, the challenge clear. "Easy for you to say, stranger. You come in here, give us a little speech, and then you'll be on your way, back to wherever you came from. We're the ones who have to live with the decisions made tonight, not you." Joe nodded, respecting the weight of Frank's words. "You're right, Frank. I won't be here when the dust settles. But that's why I'm speaking up now, because sometimes it takes someone on the outside to point out what you're too close to see. You love this town. I can see that. But love can blind you too. You're so focused on protecting what you've known that you might be missing the bigger picture." Frank's face darkened, his fists clenched at his sides. "And what would you know about it? You don't know these people like I do. You don't understand what they've been through." "I don't," Joe admitted, keeping his voice calm. "But I do know this. You're not the only one who cares. These people, your neighbors, they care too. They want what's best for Ashwood, just like you do. The difference is, they're willing to adapt, to grow, because they know that sometimes holding on too tight to the past means strangling the future." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, another voice rose from the back of the room. "I'm with Joe," said an older man in the corner, his voice rough but firm. He stood, leaning heavily on a cane, his face lined with age and experience. "This town's been my home for 80 years. I've seen it go through a lot. And I'll tell you, every time we fought change, we lost something. We can't afford to lose any more." A few others murmured in agreement. The tide was beginning to turn. Mavi seized the moment, stepping up to the podium again. "We're not asking anyone to forget the past. Ashwood's history is important. It's who we are. But we have to start thinking about who we want to be. We can honor where we've come from while still looking toward the future." Joe could see Frank's resolve wavering. The man wasn't a tyrant. He was scared of losing control, scared of losing the identity of a town he had grown up in, loved, and fought to protect. It was a fear Joe understood all too well. "Frank," Joe said, taking a step toward him, his voice softer now. "I get it. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. But it's not the enemy. The real enemy is letting that fear divide you from the people who are supposed to be your allies. These people, they're your community, your friends, and if you turn your back on them now, you might end up losing the very thing you're trying to save." For a long moment, Frank didn't speak. The room held its breath, waiting for his response. His jaw clenched and unclenched, his hands flexing at his sides as he wrestled with the words. Finally, he exhaled, a long, defeated sigh. "Maybe you're right," he muttered, though his tone still carried a hint of bitterness. "Maybe we've been fighting the wrong battle." There was a collective exhale from the crowd, the tension easing, though not completely disappearing. The room was far from unified, but this was a start, a small step in the right direction. Joe didn't expect a standing ovation or a pat on the back. He knew this kind of thing didn't resolve itself overnight. But in that moment, he felt the weight of progress. Slow, hesitant, but progress nonetheless. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. Maggie smiled, relief flooding her features. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I think we've got a lot to talk about tonight. But this is the first step." As the meeting continued, with townspeople sharing their thoughts and ideas, some more reluctantly than others, Joe slipped to the back of the room, where Ray was still leaning against the wall. "Nice speech," Ray said, his usual sarcasm tempered by a hint of genuine admiration. "Didn't know you had it in you." Joe shrugged, feeling a little awkward under the praise. "Just said what needed to be said." "Yeah, well," Ray said with a smirk, sometimes saying it's the hardest part. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the town of Ashwood begin to untangle itself, slowly but surely. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. And for a place like Ashwood, that was something. As the night wore on, and the meeting began to wind down, Joe found himself standing outside the community center, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The stars above were sharp and clear, unfiltered by city lights, a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond this small town. Ray stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about sticking around? Joe glanced at his friend, surprised by the question. I don't know. Maybe. It's a good town. Yeah, Ray said, staring out at the quiet streets. Could use a guy like you. Joe didn't respond, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Maybe he would stay, at least for a little while. Maybe Ashwood needed more than just a passing visitor. Maybe, for once, he needed a place to call home. For now, though, he would take it one day at a time. Just like the town of Ashwood. One step forward, one piece at a time. A glimmer of hope. The moon cast long shadows over Ashwood as the town meeting finally drew to a close. People filtered out of the community center in small groups, their hushed conversations carrying on the evening breeze. For once, the air wasn't filled with tension or heated arguments. Instead, there was something different, a quiet sense of possibility. Joe stood on the steps outside the community center, watching as families walked to their cars, their faces a mix of cautious optimism and fatigue. It had been a long night, but the town had taken the first steps toward real change. That was more than he could have hoped for when he first arrived. Ray nudged Joe with his elbow, breaking the silence. You've got a knack for this, you know, getting people to think, to reconsider. Joe chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm not a politician, Ray. I just said what needed to be said. People were ready for it. They just didn't realize it yet. Still, not bad for a drifter, Ray quipped, his eyes scanning the crowd. You think Frank's actually gonna come around? Joe glanced over to where Frank stood, his rigid figure framed by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Frank was talking to a few of his loyal followers, his arms crossed defensively as always, but there was a noticeable shift in his posture. His shoulders weren't as squared, and his head wasn't held quite as high. He looked more like a man deep in thought than someone preparing for battle. I don't know, Joe said, after a moment's pause. Frank's stubborn, but he's not a fool. He cares about this town. I think tonight shook him up a bit. He might not be ready to admit it, but he'll come around. Eventually. Ray snorted. Eventually. That's the key word. Man's like a damn mule. Joe smiled, though his mind was already wandering. Frank wasn't the only person Joe had to worry about. There was still so much work to be done. The meeting had been a start, but the divisions in Ashwood ran deep, and even if Frank came around, there were others, hardliners, who would fight change tooth and nail. He could feel it, like a weight pressing on his chest. Hey, you okay? Ray asked, noticing the shift in Joe's expression. Joe shook off the thought, forcing a grin. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about what comes next. What comes next is we go grab a beer, Ray said, clapping Joe on the back. You've earned it. Before Joe could respond, Maggie approached, her face still flushed with the excitement of the evening. She had been at the center of it all, guiding the discussion and rallying the more open-minded voices in the room. Joe admired her passion. She was tough, but not in the way Frank was. Her toughness came from hope, from an unshakable belief that things could get better. Joe, she said, her smile warm but tired. I just wanted to say thank you again. I don't think we would have made half the progress we did tonight without you. Joe rubbed the back of his neck, feeling slightly awkward under the praise. I didn't do much. You're the one who's been holding this town together. Maggie laughed lightly, though her eyes shone with sincerity. You did more than you realize. People needed to hear what you had to say. And more importantly, they needed to hear it from someone who wasn't caught up in all the local politics. Joe nodded, appreciating her words but feeling the weight of responsibility that came with them. I just hope they keep listening, he said quietly. They will, Maggie replied with quiet conviction. It's not going to be easy, and there will be more bumps in the road, but tonight was a turning point. I can feel it. Joe wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that Ashwood could heal, that the town could find a way to reconcile its differences and move forward. But his years of experience had taught him to temper hope with caution. Change was always met with resistance, and sometimes that resistance could be fierce. As the last of the townspeople drove off into the night, leaving the streets empty and silent, Joe felt a familiar restlessness stir inside him. Ashwood had given him a purpose, a reason to stay, at least for now. But he knew himself too well. The urge to keep moving, to drift from one place to another, was always lurking beneath the surface. He had never been the kind of man to plant roots. But something about Ashwood was different. Maybe it was the people, or maybe it was the town's stubborn resilience. Either way, for the first time in a long while, Joe wasn't in a rush to leave. There was unfinished business here, and something told him he had a role to play in it. "You know," Ray said, breaking the silence again, "you could stick around a little longer. See this thing through." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What are you, a mind reader now?" Ray shrugged, smirking. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. You've already made more of an impact in a few days than most people have in years. Be ashamed to walk away now." Maggie chimed in, her voice gentle but persuasive. "He's right, Joe. We could use someone like you. Someone who can bring people together. You don't have to make any decisions right now, but just think about it." Joe didn't reply right away. He simply nodded, giving them both a non-committal smile. "I'll think about it," he said, though in truth, the decision wasn't as simple as they made it sound. Staying meant committing to something bigger than himself, something that might not even succeed. But leaving would mean walking away from people who needed him, people he had started to care about, even if he wouldn't admit it. As Ray and Maggie walked off into the night, leaving Joe alone on the steps of the community center, he stared out at the quiet town. The breeze rustled through the trees, and the distant hum of crickets filled the air. Ashwood was still, but beneath the surface, it was alive with the potential for change. Joe leaned against the railing, his thoughts drifting back to the countless places he'd been, the lives he'd touched and then left behind. He had never stayed anywhere long enough to see the full impact of his actions. It was easier that way, less complicated. But maybe this time, things would be different. He glanced up at the stars, their cold, distant light shining down on him. Out there, the world kept turning, oblivious to the small struggles of a town like Ashwood. But here, in this moment, it felt like something important was happening, something worth fighting for. Joe sighed, pushing himself off the railing. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, he would stick around. At least long enough to see where this road led. Maybe it would lead to something good, something lasting. Or maybe it would end in disappointment, like so many other roads before it. Either way, he wasn't ready to leave just yet. With that thought in mind, Joe turned and walked into the quiet night, his footsteps echoing softly on the empty street. Tomorrow was another day, and in Ashwood, every day brought new challenges and new opportunities. For the first time in a long time, Joe felt like he was exactly where he needed to be.